Hey guys, we're going to talk about ecosystem ecology and the movement of energy and the evolution of biodiversity. What this covers is the first part of chapter 3, which is the part where we talk about the movement of energy, but before we talk about the movement of matter, because it's going to come a little later, and all of chapter 5. So if you're following me with Friedman and Relea, this is the first module of chapter 3 and all of chapter 5. So let's talk first about the movement of energy. This is a big thing in apes, and I say that a lot, but the movement of energy and tracing the movement of energy through ecosystems is kind of one of those unifying concepts in the course. So let's talk about the characteristics of ecosystems. Those are dependent upon the climate of that location, and we've already talked about biomes, and we've talked about the formation of global biomes. Where biomes are on the planet is largely dependent upon atmospheric dynamics, the circulation of the Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells. And so when we talk about the characteristics of ecosystems, we're talking about the climate of that location. There are biotic and abiotic components of every ecosystem. Biotic is the living component. Abiotic is the non-living component. And those biotic and abiotic components provide the boundaries that distinguish one ecosystem from another ecosystem. There are some ecosystems that have clear boundaries. These tend to be actually quite rare, especially terrestrially. Terrestrially, pretty much the biggest one that has clear boundaries are cave ecosystems. Cave ecosystems, even within a cave ecosystem, we have an ecosystem that's kind of at the front of the cave or the mouth of the cave, middle of the cave, and what they call deep cave ecosystems. And those actually vary for one another. But the cave itself is a very bounded ecosystem. You know where the cave is, and it has clear boundaries. Many aquatic ecosystems, however, also have clear boundaries. Lakes, ponds, and streams. I mean, you know when you're in a lake, when you're in a pond, when you're a stream, and when you're not. However, most ecosystems, especially terrestrial ecosystems, have unclear boundaries. And some boundaries are actually not scientific boundaries. When I say scientific boundaries, I'm talking about boundaries that are based on climate that we talked about before. Some ecosystem boundaries are what we call administrative or managed boundaries. National parks and state parks are examples of administrative boundaries where the ecosystem is bounded by an artificial line that humans have drawn upon that ecosystem, saying this is where we're going to, this is the boundary of the park, and this is where we're going to manage things, and beyond that is outside of park boundaries. Now, in actuality, obviously those ecosystems extend beyond the boundaries of the park, but there can be very different characteristics of ecosystems within the park where things are protected versus outside the park where development is permitted and where species are not protected. So we've got natural or scientific boundaries based on climate, and then we have administrative or artificial boundaries that are based on legislation, basically, like this is where the park's going to end. Ecosystems can be very large, such as the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is about 2.2 million acres. And I'm going to actually say this is a hybrid ecosystem. Part of that is a natural ecosystem bordered by the Yellowstone, the characteristics of the Yellowstone National Park boundary. And then some of that is actually artificial, where the park officials have said this is the boundary of the national park. Outside of the national park that is there, there is development that's permitted that's not permitted inside the park. So you do have a contiguous scientific boundary based on climate that is artificially imposed based on the boundary of the park. So this is kind of one of those hybrid scientific and administrative boundaries. However, this is a very large ecosystem. Ecosystems can also be very small, like a water-filled hole in a fallen tree trunk. And both of these examples are drawn from your book, so you can read more about it there. But a water-filled hole in a fallen tree trunk is very small. It's also a very bounded ecosystem. As soon as you move away from the hole, you're no longer in the ecosystem. But a water-filled hole in a fallen tree trunk has everything that an ecosystem should have in order to fulfill that definition. It's got both biotic and abiotic components, and it's got communities of organisms that are interacting together. Every ecosystem interacts with surrounding ecosystems through the exchange of both matter and energy. This particular PowerPoint presentation is going to deal with the energy part of it. We're going to get to the matter part in a little later. And many organisms, especially the ones that fly, regularly cross ecosystem boundaries, which leads to widespread ecosystem change. So it's difficult, again, to say where the boundaries of ecosystems begin and end. And part of that is because there is a constant flow of both matter and energy across those boundaries. Ecosystems have organisms that are mobile, and the ones that are the most highly mobile are ones that are that fly in the air: birds, bats, and insects that fly as well. These organisms transfer both matter and energy across ecosystem boundaries. The combination of all ecosystems on Earth is called the biosphere. I'm sure you've heard that term before. You should have been introduced to it in biology. All life on the planet resides in the biosphere. So let's talk a little bit about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is something that you should have obviously been introduced to in biology. Hopefully you remember some of this stuff from biology. I'm going to go through a quick review of it, but we don't have the time here to kind of go in depth, nor do you really need to in apes. This is not AP Bio, but we had an FRQ on photosynthesis and cellular respiration several years ago, and that FRQ was pretty much directly taken from the AP Bio exam. If you don't understand the mechanics of photosynthesis, you really need to brush up. The textbook does a great job of this, and I encourage you to look at that. So photosynthesis is an energy conversion process that absorbs energy. Photosynthesis is performed by plants. It's performed by most types of algae and some bacteria. These organisms are considered autotrophic producers. The word autotrophic is right here. Auto means self and trophic means feeding. So photosynthetic organisms feed themselves. Well, what do they feed themselves? They feed themselves glucose. That is what they're producing. And they're producing that from water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. So the inputs for photosynthesis are water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. And the things that come out of that process are glucose and oxygen. We're going to talk a little bit more about the balanced equation. One of the things that the FRQ asked was to the student to write the balanced chemical equation for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Prior to that FRQ, most APES teachers did not go into depth about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, even though it's kind of a foundational concept. Since that FRQ came out, we really actually teach this quite a bit more. So let's take a look at this chemical equation. You all have had chemistry, so you should be familiar with how chemical equations work. They read from left to right. So we have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. When those are combined with the light energy from the sun, it yields 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. So in this particular equation, the glucose is the food. When I say that they're autotrophic, that is the food that they are producing. And the oxygen is the waste gas here. Plants do not need oxygen, and oxygen is off-gassed by the plant as a waste gas. And it's a good thing that it is, because it is what consumers actually need to do cellular respiration. So we talked a little bit in class about this word right here, chemosynthetic. Chemo means chemical, and synthesis or synthetic means to make or to build. Deep marine bacteria produce glucose from inorganic compounds, from chemicals, and that's why they're called chemosynths. Chemosynthesis happens where there is no light to drive photosynthesis. Up until the 1970s, most scientists believed that there was no life at the bottom of the ocean. In the 1970s, there was a sub that was created. That sub's name was Alvin. And by sub, I mean submarine. Prior to that, we had not explored the deepest regions of the ocean. In the 1970s, when Alvin was created, scientists went to the deep sea ocean, to the Marianas Trench and the deepest parts of the ocean for the first time. And what they found down there was absolutely astounding. The prediction was that there would be no life, and that could not have been further from the truth. There are deep sea hydrothermal vents down at the bottom of the ocean that expel this compound right here, hydrogen sulfide. In deep sea ecosystems, hydrogen sulfide is providing the energy to produce glucose for these chemosynthetic bacteria. There is no light there. So the producers in the ecosystem are these chemosynthetic bacteria. Now, the chemosynthetic bacteria usually live within the bodies of an organism called a tube worm. And those tube worms are present around these deep sea hydrothermal vents. So this is, again, an energy capture process. And what they're using is hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide to create glucose. So again, they're producing glucose. Every glucose molecule on Earth was originally made by either photosynthetic or chemosynthetic producers. The basis of all life on Earth are these organisms. Producers produce the glucose that we need, that every other trophic level on Earth needs in order to function. No producers, no life. If plants or photosynthetic or chemosynthetic organisms were to perish, the food chain would collapse and there would be no life on Earth. Cellular respiration is basically the opposite of photosynthesis. Cellular respiration is a energy conversion that actually releases energy. It's a process that occurs in all eukaryotic cells right there. And I don't know if you guys remember what eukaryotic means. It means it contains a nucleus. U means true and karyo means kernel. And the kernel that they're referring to is the nucleus. And it occurs in the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the organelle that it occurs in. Now, I did not mention in the previous slide, photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts of plant cells. In chemosense, it occurs in a slightly different way. But if they were talking about like where does photosynthesis occur, in which organelle, the answer to that would be in the chloroplasts. So all eukaryotic cells, that means all cells with a nucleus, contain an organelle called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria take the glucose. Now, the glucose, of course, can come from photosynthesis or chemosynthesis in the case of autotrophs, or it can come through the ingestion or the consumption of glucose in the case of heterotrophs. So the glucose comes into the cell, it moves into the mitochondria, and through the process of cellular respiration, that glucose is broken down into ATP. ATP is the energy molecule that the cell uses, and the chemical bonds in that glucose are broken down, and this actually creates 36 ATP molecules right there. Cellular respiration requires oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct or a waste product of photosynthesis. So cellular respiration must occur in the presence of oxygen. We learned in the last slide that autotrophs off-gas oxygen. It's their waste product. So the waste product, or one of the products of photosynthesis, is the reactant for cellular respiration. So let's take a look at the balanced chemical equation for cellular respiration. We need glucose, and we need 6 oxygen molecules, which is right there. And when we combine those, we get carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. And that's what that 6, the coefficient 6 means there. And again, you guys have all been through chemistry, so you know this. 6 molecules of water and ATP that's released. And I liked this particular diagram here because ATP is shown with this kind of like sunburst thing. ATP is an energy molecule, and you have to kind of set it apart from the regular products of photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide and water are matter, ATP is energy. So it needs to kind of be set apart in this when we're talking about the difference between the flow of matter and the flow of energy. And if you think back to photosynthesis, that's one of the reasons that the sunlight was placed above the process arrow in the equation rather than in the reactants side. Because sunlight is really not a reactant for photosynthesis. It is the battery, it's the driver, it's the energy source that actually drives the entire thing. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about fermentation. Fermentation is a type of respiration. Yes, it is. But it doesn't require oxygen, which means it is anaerobic. And I'm going to write that word, A-E-R-O-B-I-C. Anaerobic means not requiring oxygen. It occurs in the cytoplasm, not in the mitochondria. So prokaryotic cells like bacteria that do not have specialized organelles can also perform fermentation. Fermentation creates, and I said harmful waste products right here. Some of those waste products are harmful and some of them are not harmful. When plant cells or single-celled organisms like yeast undergo fermentation, they produce things like alcohol. Alcohol, this is the same alcohol that people drink. So that is a waste product that is not actually harmful, but it is a waste product. But lactic acid, when animal cells undergo fermentation, they produce lactic acid. Lactic acid is actually quite harmful to an animal cell. It's what produces muscular soreness after exercise. And these products, alcohol or lactic acid, have to be removed from the cell before they cause cellular damage. Fermentation is also much less efficient than cellular respiration. So we were saying that on average, cellular respiration creates 36 molecules of ATP for every glucose. Fermentation only creates 2. So if there's a choice in cellular metabolism between aerobic cellular respiration and fermentation, the more efficient process is cellular respiration. Cells prefer to do cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen because it just yields so much more energy for them. Energy captured by producers during photosynthesis moves through trophic levels of an ecosystem. So again, I want you to kind of picture plants or other photosynthetic organisms capturing sunlight and converting that solar energy into chemical energy, the chemical energy in the bonds of glucose. That is the basis of the trophic structure in every ecosystem. That energy, which at its base comes from the sun, moves through the trophic structure of an ecosystem. The energy is captured by producers and it flows into consumers. Consumers are also called heterotrophs. We talked about the term autotrophs in the previous slide. Autotroph means self-feeding. Heterotroph means different feeding. Hetero means different, troph means feeding. So it's organisms that receive their nourishment from a different source than themselves. Consumers that eat producers are called primary or first level consumers. These are also called herbivores. Anything that eats a plant is a primary or first level consumer or an herbivore. Consumers that eat primary consumers are called secondary consumers. These are also generally called carnivores. For the most part, secondary consumers are carnivores. Consumers that eat secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers, tertiary means third level, so these are third level consumers. The successive levels of organisms consuming one another in an ecosystem are known as trophic levels. And again, this is a review of biology. Some organisms consume at several different trophic levels. We call these organisms omnivores. So there are organisms, humans are one of them. There are other examples. Bears are another good example. Pigs are another good example. Raccoons are also omnivores. There are several types of organisms that consume at different levels of the trophic structure, and we call those omnivores. Omnivores eat both meat and vegetable. The sequence of consumption from producers to top level consumers is called a food chain. A food web is a complex model of how these food chains interact within ecosystems. And we'll be building some food chains and kind of seeing how they interact within ecosystems as we kind of go on through this. So this is an example of a food web. The arrows in this food web show the direction of energy flow. When I teach biology, I call these arrows goes into arrows. Because what it means is the energy from this goes into this other organism. So for my biology kids, I could say the energy goes into, so I call them goes into arrows. So let's start here along the bottom with the rotting log, the dead leaves, the dead animals, and the maple tree leaves. So some of these are detrital. Rotting log, dead leaves, and dead animals, those are detritus. Those are not production. The maple tree leaves are photosynthetic producers, but some of these, the energy from these detrital food webs are actually feeding in. So the energy from the rotting log is flowing into the bracket fungus. It's also flowing into bacteria, and this is archaea actually also, and it's flowing into these puffballs. Puffballs are a type of fungus. The dead leaves from many species, detritus as well, flowing into bacteria. Bacteria is what's breaking down the energy there. Also flowing into pill bugs. Pill bugs eat dead leaves. They have to help to break them down. They're detritivores. Dead animals from many species, the energy from those organisms is broken down and feeds into bacteria, also feeding insect larvae in the form of maggots. Maggots are fly larvae. So the only true producer in this bottom level here are our maple tree leaves. Maple tree leaves are photosynthetic and they're eaten by crickets. But of course you can see on this secondary level right here, we've got many different organisms that are actually that are feeding their energy into successive. Now the bracket fungus itself, that energy flow stops right there. You can see that there's no arrows coming out of the bracket fungus. But as we follow the arrows up from the bacteria and the archaea, the bacteria energy from that's feeding into the earthworm and the millipede. The puffball, which is a type of fungus, is also feeding into the millipede. Millipedes and earthworms are also detritivores. Pill bugs, the pill bugs are eaten by the robins. They're also eaten by the alligator lizards. The insect larvae are eaten by the alligator lizards. And the crickets, which feed on these true producers down here, the maple tree leaves, the crickets are eaten by the robin. The crickets are also eaten by the alligator lizard. So the energy from the crickets flows into the robin and the alligator lizards. So as we move up here, the next level would be the earthworms and the millipedes here, which are detritivores. Earthworms are obviously eaten by robins. They're also eaten by alligator lizards. The robin and the alligator lizards, as secondary consumers, are the energy from them. The Cooper's hawk eats the robin. The fox also eats the robin, as it does the alligator lizard. So if we were talking about top level consumers here, this would be those guys right here, Cooper's hawk and foxes. So this particular food web shows both detrital and production webs. On the handout that I gave you in class, we separated the detrital and the production webs. This is just another way of showing that. So we have to count for the energy that is being recycled by detritivores and decomposers in the ecosystem as well. So every trophic level produces dead individuals and waste products like we saw in the previous example. There are three groups of organisms that feed on dead matter: scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers. I mentioned detritivores and decomposers in the previous slide. I have not really talked about scavengers. Scavengers directly consume dead animals. An example of this would be a vulture. This is an animal that as soon as an animal dies, they come and they eat the relatively fresh carcass. Detritivores specialize in breaking down dead tissue and waste products into smaller particles. These are again feeding on dead organisms, but they're basically, they break down both pretty much mechanically. I'm going to say mechanically, physically break down this dead tissue. They eat the dead tissue and they break it down into smaller particles. A good example of this would be a dung beetle. Dung beetles do exactly what you might think that they do. They break down and they consume dung. The dung is also used for other purposes. They lay their eggs in the dung as well. Decomposers complete the breakdown process by converting organic matter into smaller elements that can be recycled back into the ecosystem. So decomposers primarily in ecosystems are things like bacteria and fungi. Scavengers tend to be larger animals like a vulture. Detritivores tend to be smaller. Detritivores would be something like an earthworm, a millipede, a pillbug. Those tend to be detritivores. Usually invertebrates, all the things that I just mentioned are invertebrates. Decomposers tend to be even smaller organisms like bacteria and fungi that are capable of taking the broken down tissue that detritivores leave behind and actually recycling those nutrients back into the ecosystem. So some ecosystems are more productive than others. We kind of talked about this a little bit in class when we were talking about how much sunlight falls on a particular ecosystem or in a particular biome. The amount of energy that's available in an ecosystem determines how much life an ecosystem can support. And of course, at the bottom of the trophic structure, the producers are fueled by incoming sunlight. So when you have a lot of incoming sunlight, you have a larger amount of primary production, and you have a deeper trophic structure. You have a wider base and more layers that can be supported. So gross primary productivity, which we abbreviate as GPP, of an ecosystem is a measure of the total amount of solar energy that the producers in that ecosystem capture via photosynthesis over a given amount of time. So it's the higher the solar energy, the greater the gross primary productivity. The net primary productivity is the GPP, the gross primary productivity, subtracting the energy lost when the producers perform cellular respiration for themselves. And we talked again about this in class. Plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you have to take what they produce and you have to subtract what they use in their own cellular metabolism in order to get how much energy is actually available to the remaining trophic structure, because plants have to use some of it on their own bodies. So net primary productivity is GPP, which is gross primary productivity minus the respiration by producers themselves. GPP is commonly figured by measuring the amount of carbon dioxide that is taken up during photosynthesis versus the rate at which carbon dioxide is produced during respiration. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's measured, because it's one of the things that I told you needed to know, and it's on that biozone worksheet where we're talking about the bottle that was light colored and the bottle that was dark colored, and you understanding what that experiment was talking about. All right, so this is the experiment that I was referring to when I was talking about this in class and saying that I was going to talk about it in the presentation. So first, when we're talking about understanding how this works, we have to measure the production of carbon dioxide in the dark. So carbon dioxide is produced during cellular respiration. If it's in the dark, that means that photosynthesis is not happening. There's no light to drive photosynthesis. So this is done because no photosynthesis is taking place in the dark. So it eliminates carbon dioxide uptake during photosynthesis. So this is simply carbon dioxide production during cellular respiration. So we're measuring that first. Next, you measure the uptake of carbon dioxide in the sunlight. So first, we're talking about the production of carbon dioxide during cellular respiration when no photosynthesis is happening. Now, the next part is we're going to measure the uptake of carbon dioxide during sunlight hours. So this gives you the net movement of carbon dioxide when respiration and photosynthesis are both occurring. So if you look down here at the bottom, you've got a light bottle where it says photosynthesis and respiration are both occurring. Okay, and then you've got the dark bottle where only respiration is occurring. So this is exactly what I just said. So this right here, first you have to, oops, I'm moving the thing. Here we go. Hang on for just a sec. This part is this first part. So where it says first you have to measure the production of CO2 in the dark. That's this dark bottle right here. This is done so that you're eliminating the production of CO2, CO2 is not produced during photosynthesis, but you're eliminating that altogether. Then you're going to measure the uptake of CO2 in the sunlight. And this step is right here. Okay. So this gives you the net movement of carbon dioxide when respiration and photosynthesis are both occurring. So the third step is you add the amount of carbon dioxide produced in the dark, that's the step 1, to the amount of carbon dioxide produced in sunlight, that's step 2, to get the gross amount of carbon dioxide taken up during photosynthesis. So here's what the equation looks like. Carbon dioxide taken up during photosynthesis is equal to the carbon dioxide taken up in the sunlight plus the carbon dioxide produced in the dark. Okay, and that is exactly what the biozone sheet is talking about, with the light bottle and the dark bottle suspended, and then you measure that stuff. So I kind of wanted to go through that in this slide as well. Photosynthesis is an extremely inefficient process. In fact, it's only about 1% efficient. What that means is that only about 1% of solar energy that reaches producers, that means sunlight falling on the leaves of plants, only about 1% of that solar energy is actually used or fixed for photosynthesis. Most incoming solar energy is lost as re-radiated heat that returns to the atmosphere. So incoming solar radiation hits a plant leaf. About 1% of that the plant uses to do photosynthesis. The rest is returned as re-radiating heat to the atmosphere. Some of this solar energy is reflected also as wavelengths of light that the plant cannot use. So you guys know probably from physics that plants appear green because green is the wavelength of light that plants do not use for photosynthesis. All the other wavelengths are absorbed. The green wavelength is reflected, and that's why plants appear to be green. And this little diagram right here, I got this directly out of the book. I literally snapped a photo of it, made it into a little PNG, and stuck it in here. So I liked it because the arrows, if you look at the size of the arrows, they're proportional. Do you see this very, very large fat red arrow that I'm pointing to right here? This arrow says 99% of solar energy is reflected or passes through producers without being absorbed. So literally, almost all of the energy is being wasted. This right here, gross primary productivity, 1% of solar energy striking producers is captured as photosynthesis, and that's that right there. So this is GPP, that 1% out of the 100%. 99 is lost, 1% is captured. 60% of that gross primary productivity is lost to respiration, is lost to cellular respiration. And then the remainder, right, the remaining 40% of GPP supports the growth and reproduction of producers, which is the NPP. So this is kind of an important little graphic here, and this is one of the reasons that I snapped a pic and stuck it in this PowerPoint, because I thought it was pretty powerful, and I wanted you to draw your attention to it. So the net primary productivity of ecosystems ranges from about 25 to 50% of the gross primary productivity. It really takes a lot of energy to perform photosynthesis. My ninth graders, my biology students, frequently ask me, Miss, why are we not photosynthetic? And the answer is, well, because we need to move. Photosynthesis requires a ton of incoming solar radiation. It's also very, very inefficient. It is a terrible way to feed oneself. So if you are a creature, I'm just going to use the word creature. If you're a creature that needs to move and needs to do stuff, photosynthesis is not for you. You cannot produce enough energy from sunlight to meet your needs for photosynthesis unless you are not moving. Plants do not move. They can stay in one place and they can live and grow there. You also know that plants do not grow as quickly as animals do for the most part. So For organisms that need to move quickly and have a high cellular metabolism, photosynthesis just doesn't produce enough glucose in order for those organisms to thrive. And that is why heterotrophs evolved. They are organisms that can consume glucose in much larger amounts than can be made by producers during photosynthesis. So they have a much higher cellular metabolism, they live and grow more quickly, and they're much more active. Plants grow, we know that they're alive, but they're not highly active like consumers are. Okay, this particular slide is actually, there's a lot of data here, and we kind of need to work through it. I actually used a slide like this when I was thinking about some of the kind of the questions that I wanted to write for some of our exams. This can be very confusing, and we need to look at our key, and we need to look at what each graph shows. So we're going to take it piece by piece. So you guys can see here that we're talking about different types of biomes, and some of them are terrestrial and some of them are aquatic. The aquatic biomes are shown in, well, first off, let's take that back. The marine aquatic biomes are shown in dark blue, and they occur right there. So it's open ocean, continental shelf, estuary, algal beds and reefs, and upwelling zones. Those are all marine biomes or marine ecosystems. Our terrestrial ecosystems are shown from here all the way down to here. Those are terrestrial, and those are shown in green, and you can look here at the key. We just talked about marine. Here's our terrestrial. Terrestrial shown on green, and they include extreme desert rock ice, on through cultivated land. Cultivated land would be agricultural, boreal, woodland, tundra, blah, blah, blah. All right, and the last part of this are our freshwater on-continent freshwater biomes, and they're shown in kind of this bright blue down here if you look at the key. So we have three different kind of categories of biomes that we're looking at: marine, terrestrial, and freshwater on continents. So the first graph here, this A part, shows these biomes as a percentage of the Earth's surface area. And if you take a look at that, it's very, very clear that the largest percentage of the Earth's surface area is open ocean. And there it is right there. It's at 65%. 65% of the Earth's surface area is covered by the open ocean. If you were to look at your terrestrial biomes, which one would cover the most of the terrestrial biomes? It's right here. Extreme desert, rock, sand, and ice, right here at 4.7%. But you can see that that's, in comparison to open ocean, that's a tiny, tiny percentage. So what is Earth mostly? It's mostly ocean. It's mostly ocean water. So moving on to graph B right here. Graph B says this is our average net primary production in grams per meter squared per year. So we need to look at our outliers here. This is the first one, algal beds and reefs. So algal beds, which means basically algae beds, right? Algae are photosynthetic protists. Although the open ocean covers 65% of the Earth, it only accounts for 125 grams per cubic meter per year, meter squared per year of our average net primary production. By far, our most productive ecosystem, our most productive marine ecosystem is algal beds and coral reefs. When we move down here at a close second, right here to tropical rainforest, when we move down here, to our terrestrial ecosystems, we're talking tropical rainforest as our most productive. And there it is right there. So I'm following it along across right to there. So tropical rainforests of our terrestrial biomes are the most productive at 2,200 grams per meter squared per year. And then as we move down here to our freshwater biomes, swamps and marshes, again, are our most productive. When I say productive, I mean net primary production, our most productive freshwater biomes on continents. And you can see that they're all pretty high, right? 2,000, 2,200, and 2,500 are all very close to one another, okay? So these are very productive biomes. They're very high in productivity. So C, percentage of Earth's net primary production, this is where we kind of take both A and B and kind of talk about which is in terms of absolute, which one's the most productive. So again, let's take a look here. Open ocean right here at 24.4%, where it says percentage of Earth's net primary production. If a question asks you by percent which biome or which ecosystem is the most productive on Earth, the answer is the open ocean. Check this out, right? The open ocean is the most productive. However, part of the reason for it doesn't have the highest average net primary. Look, this is what I'm looking at right here. But because it is so large, it still is going to be the biome that produces the most, that has the highest net primary production on Earth. Open ocean is the highest net primary production on Earth. But that it doesn't mean that that is the highest average net primary production. It just means that their net primary production of 125 is multiplied by the fact that it's 65% of the Earth's surface to produce this 24.4% of the Earth's primary production. Coming in at a close second right here is tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest, when you look at its actual percentage of Earth's surface area, is low. It's only 3.3%, but its production is high. So when you look at the percentage of the average net primary productivity times the percentage of its surface area on Earth, it still has a very high percentage of Earth's net production. So here's where these freshwater biomes kind of fall off, and that's right here. So if you look at B, swamps and marshes, they have a very, very high average net primary productivity. But look at the percentage of the Earth's surface that they cover. They're very small. They're only 0.4% of the Earth's surface area. So even though they have really high average net primary production, because they're only 0.4% of the Earth's surface, they do not contribute that much to the Earth's net primary production, only 2.3%. Lots of our terrestrial biomes are actually higher than that. You can see that the savanna, I mean, even ones that you think that aren't big producers, like, boreal forest is at 9.6%. So although boreal forest wasn't a super high producer with average net, because boreal forest covers a larger percentage of the Earth surface wise, it actually it kind of outpaces these swamps and marshes in terms of percentage of Earth's net primary production. So the only way that I've ever seen this asked on the exam is really about the open ocean here. So first off, if they're asking you a question, pay very close attention to whether or not they're asking you about aquatic ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems. If they're asking you about aquatic, they're probably going for open ocean. If they're asking you about terrestrial, they're probably going for tropical rainforest. If the question is about aquatic, be sure that they're talking about marine versus freshwater. If we're talking about marine, the answer is probably something to do with open ocean. If we're talking about freshwater, the answer is probably something to do with swamps and marshes. But at the end of the day, when we talk about the biome that has the largest percentage of Earth's primary production, we are talking about the open ocean. And the reason why, I'm going to go through this one more time. Look, you see me putting like 8 million boxes around this? The reason why is because the open ocean is 65% of the Earth's surface. And although its average net primary production is not super high, because it comprises so much of the surface, its percentage of primary production is actually quite high. A close second again is tropical rainforest for terrestrial biomes. I hope that you understand that. Please come to tutoring if you don't. So the efficiency of energy transfer affects the energy present in each trophic level. And so again, energy transfer is kind of the overarching theme of this whole thing. We talked about biomass. We're doing a lab on biomass. Biomass is the total mass of all living matter in a specific area. Bio, living, mass, the mass of something. The amount of biomass present in an ecosystem at any given time is referred to as the standing crop. Now, this is a little confusing. Standing crop does not necessarily mean it's a crop, like an agricultural crop. It just means how much biomass is present at any given time. Standing crop differs from productivity because some ecosystems, especially slow growing ecosystems like forests, they have low annual productivity, but the large trees have a super high biomass, and so they have a higher or a large standing crop. In contrast, the productivity of algae in the ocean is quite high, and we just saw that on the last slide. So the productivity of algal beds and algae in the ocean is very high. But algae die quickly and they're also eaten quickly. So that particular ecosystem has a low standing crop. You need to understand the difference between that. So again, productivity in forest ecosystems is relatively low, but standing crop is high. Productivity in algal beds is very high, but the standing crop is low because they're eaten or they die very quickly. The proportion of consumed energy that can be passed from one trophic level to another is called the ecological efficiency of a ecosystem or of a trophic level. This ranges from about 5% to a maximum of about 20%. I'm going to actually write that. So the average is 5 to 20%, but it typically falls at about 10%. So you guys have actually heard this before. We call that the 10% rule. In any type of trophic structure, when we move from level to level, from producers to consumers, from primary consumers to secondary consumers, and so on, about 90% of the available energy in any given trophic level is lost. Only 10% of that energy is passed on. And that's the ecological efficiency that we're talking about. But it varies from ecosystem and it varies from trophic level to trophic level, and it can be calculated. Trophic pyramids represent the distribution of biomass. They can, and there's three different types. So they can represent the distribution of biomass. They can represent the numbers of organisms, or the energy among trophic levels. And we're actually going to see examples of these on the next few slides. So this slide reiterates kind of what I said on the previous slide. The percentage of energy transferred from one trophic level to the next varies between 5 and 20%. And this is referred to as the ecological efficiency. When you were in biology, we usually used an average figure of 10%. We called it the 10% law, or the 10% rule. What that meant was that only about 10% of the energy that was available in one trophic level was passed on to the next. 90% of that energy was either lost as heat or was used by the organisms in that trophic level themselves. So if we take this caterpillar, for example, we have 200 joules of incoming energy that the caterpillar is using, right, from plant material that's consumed. 100 joules of that is going towards caterpillar poop. That's waste production by the caterpillar. 33 joules of that is headed toward growth, and then 67 joules of that is used for cellular respiration, which again breaks down the glucose that's present in the plants into ATP. So this ecological efficiency is something that can be calculated. You are doing that in some of your biozone worksheets. So we will do a couple of ecological efficiency problems, and that is something that's absolutely fair game on the APES exam. It's fairly easy to calculate. All right, so I had talked to you about the fact there are different types of ecological pyramids. There are pyramids of numbers, pyramids of biomass, and pyramids of energy. So pyramids of numbers is a pyramid in which the size of each tier, and that's what I'm looking at right here. The size of each tier is proportional to the number of individuals present in each trophic level. And when we say number of individuals present, that means that's what we mean by the pyramid of numbers. So in this particular example right here, this is what I'm looking at right here. We're talking about the numbers of producers, the numbers of primary consumers, the numbers of secondary consumers, and the numbers of tertiary consumers. So we've got 1,500,000 producers, we've got 200,000 primary consumers, we've got 90,000 secondary consumers, and we've got 1 tertiary consumer. Pyramids of biomass, that's this one right over here. Each tier represents the total dry weight of organisms at each trophic level. We are actually doing a dry weight biomass experiment right now with our bean plants. That's why we had to dry them out. So in this particular one, we've got 809 grams per meter squared, which is the production level. At the first consumer level, we have 37 grams per meter squared. At the secondary consumer level, we have 11 grams per meter squared. So this is just measuring the biomass, total dry weight of organisms at each trophic level. Pyramids are of energy or pyramids of production. Each tier is proportional to the production, generally speaking in kilojoules. I have yet to see one that's not in kilojoules. I'm sure they probably exist, but I haven't seen them. Kilojoules is a unit of energy for each trophic level. So pyramids of energy, and these are the ones that you probably saw most commonly in biology. If we started with 8,690 kilojoules of energy in the producers, we ended up with 142 kilojoules of energy in the primary consumers, and then in the secondary consumers, 12 kilojoules. So where did the rest of the energy go? Well, we can never forget that we've got a detrail food web. That's what we call the shadow food web that kind of goes along with this. This is one of the things that you guys did not talk about when you were in biology. We never really took into account how much energy was siphoned off from the decomposers, but we do have to account for that now that we're in AP, environmental science. In a typical pyramid of numbers, the number of individuals supported by the ecosystem at each successive trophic level declines. So your largest number is going to obviously be producers, and the smallest number will be tertiary consumers. This reflects the fact that there's smaller biomass, that the smaller biomass of a top-level consumer tends to be concentrated in a relatively small number of large animals. Top-level consumers, guys, are big animals. There are predators, and they tend to have really, really high energy requirements. Because of that, an ecosystem can only support a few of these top consumers. There's a few exceptions. So we're going to take a look at some kind of odd looking trophic structures and pyramids of numbers. So in some forests, a few producers of very large size, like very, very large trees, and I'm thinking specifically about sequoias and redwoods in the Pacific Northwest, they may support a larger number of consumers, and so the pyramid is inverted. So take a look at this pyramid right here. In this forest pyramid, this producer level is showing you the number of large, very large, old-growth trees in the forest. So we're talking about big, like long-lived sequoias, big redwoods that live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There may not be very many of those in a forest, but because their biomass is so high, they can actually support a large number of consumer levels. So if you take a look at that, we have an inverted pyramid where our the number of producers is actually quite small, and it's smaller than the number of consumers at the levels. This right here, this grassland pyramid of numbers, is a typical looking pyramid of numbers where you've got way, 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 way more numbers of producers than you do for any consumers in any of these successive layers. So the grassland is very typical. The forest tends to be an inverted pyramid of numbers. This is one, by the way, the reason that I'm bringing this up in a slide is because the test loves to give you something like a forest pyramid of numbers and ask, why is it inverted that way? That's why I'm telling you. All right, so pyramids of biomass. Again, biomass is the dry weight of the organisms in that trophic structure. So it's the dry weight is usually used to measure, it is usually used as a measure of mass because the water content of an organism varies. So organism size is taken into account, so meaningful comparisons of the different trophic levels are possible. Biomass pyramids may be inverted in some systems. And again, we need to talk about those because this English Channel one was actually used on an FRQ back in the day. And this particularly occurs in plankton communities. So let's take a look right here. In plankton or protist communities where there's photosynthetic protists going on, the algae right here, and of course, this is biomass, right? The algal producers, their biomass is actually low, but they reproduce rapidly and have a high productivity. So the algae in the English Channel, these plankton or phytoplankton, their biomass, they're tiny. These guys are little teeny tiny things. And so their biomass is actually going to be low, but they reproduce rapidly. So these algae can actually support a larger number of consumers because their reproduction rate is so high, even though their biomass is low. This Florida bog community is the more typical looking biomass pyramid, and you can see that the largest number is of producers there. The Florida bog community, those producers would be plants. And so we've got 109 grams per meter squared, and then that is our largest level that supports a smaller level of primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. The English Channel one, and this occurs in many algal food webs. The algae, the biomass is actually smaller, but they can support greater numbers of consumers because their reproduction rate is very, very high. Pyramids of energy often are very, very similar to pyramids of biomass in what they look like. The energy content at each trophic level is, again, generally comparable to the biomass because similar amounts of dry biomass tend to have the same energy content. So this example, these two examples here, illustrates the similarity between pyramids of biomass in grams per meter squared and pyramids of energy, which is in kilojoules, like we were talking about before, in a freshwater lake community. So both of these pictures right here, both of these diagrams are of a freshwater lake community. The kilojoules one is the pyramids of energy, and this one up here is the pyramid of biomass, and it's for the same community. And you can see that they actually have similar structures. The only thing that is taken into account in the pyramid of energy that's not in the pyramid of biomass is this part right here, the decomposers, because we have to account for where the energy is going. So in biomass, you can see that we've got a very large base there with our producers, and we have a much smaller consumer 1 and consumer 2. The pyramid of energy for the same community looks very, very similar. We've got a very large producer base and a smaller primary consumer and a smaller secondary consumer. The only difference here is that pyramids of energy must take into account energy lost to the decomposers or to the detrital food webs.